show everybody how I did this. I just took cut this out. It's just a little template, and I was able to lay it on a blank piece of watercolor paper, lightly trace around it, and then I came up with my drawing. And the drawing is just literally a trace out of the horse and rider. And then I lightly put in my perspective lines for the stadium, working from my photo reference. And then I end up with, this is our end game where we hope to end up today. But one of the things I always am talking to people about planning your composition. And I don't think people really understand what that means. It means that as artists, when we are thinking about putting together a painting, we want to visualize how we're going to accomplish that. We want to kind of visualize what the end painting would look like, but it also requires kind of establishing in our mind the steps we're going to take to accomplish that. And that takes the mystery out of it. That takes the complexity out of it. And so I put together a series of little images here that I want to share with you that kind of shows you my thought process as I'm thinking about how I'm going to approach a painting. The very first image I have here is my first wash. I leave the rider and the horse as a total negative shape. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a very light glaze that's cool, primarily cobalt, maybe a little bit of umber in it. And I'm going to just wet the paper and work around the rider and the horse, which are my center of interest, and block in a wash that creates a one step down in value. We let that dry. And while you're painting that, I'm going to be drying mine so I can go on to the next step. I will take it down a little bit further in value, and then start introducing a little bit dark in the shadow areas up underneath the rooftop of the stadium. We let that dry while you're painting it. And then I will come into my third wash, and that's when I start really doing some of the modeling of all the people in the background. And I'm not, if I zoom in on this, there's really not anything that's real detailed. It's just a matter of trying to create movement, some lights, some darks, some various things within that one big long horizontal shape that runs behind our center of interest. And then I can also get in a little bit darker underneath the overhang here, so it feels like we got some depth. And because all of this is going to be done very wet, I can use some tissues and I can kind of pick up a little bit of the paint that's still damp. I can create sort of a misty, in and out of focus, because our depth of field wants to push all of this information way into the background. And it's all going to be about our rider and the horses, where all our detailing goes. As I back my camera up, our fourth step that we're going to take today is, once I have the background and the stadium pretty well established, the ground level established, all of these are very subtle, kind of mid-tone shapes, some fairly dark around the horse. We push our darks in around his white shirt and hat, but then I leave the fence area behind him fairly light, so that once this is dry, I can then come in and start painting the horse and all the detail. And then the very final step is when we get in and start doing our final detailing with the horse, the bridle, the saddle, his shafts, his stirrups, and all the little fun things in our center of interest. I'll even show you how to maybe blur or soften some of the edge work down to give an illusion of this movement of this horse leaping up into the air. And so you lose some of the focus down around his feet because he's moving pretty fast. And so at any rate, this is what I talk about when I'm saying, let's plan slow so that we can paint fast. And it's visualizing the steps we're going to take today as we develop this into a painting. And it really simplifies the whole thing, so we don't get caught up into having to do too much at any one stage. If we just kind of focus on what our goal is at each step, we'll be very successful in coming out with a really dynamic and energetic painting. So as I move this away from the camera, here's the the finished painting, the sample painting that I did. And you can see a lot of the information where all the people are in the background in the grandstands. There's nothing there. It's just a lot of soft lights and darks within that background. And I use that as a means to push some of my darks up against the rider to make him more in contrast with what's behind him, particularly up in the shadows inside the stadium's overhang, the rooftop. So we'll come back. I'll keep bringing this back and reminding us where we're going as we go through each step so that we don't lose sight of our end game. So here's the actual line drawing I developed. I'm going to be working with a big flat, and I just want to wet my paper. So I'm going to get some water, and I'm just going to use this flat to come in around the edge of my rider's shirts, hats, the horse's neck. I'm not going to worry about protecting his mane. I'm just going to kind of come in around his face, and I will make sure that I come in quickly and fill in the rest of the paper with water so that it's going to eventually be a wet glaze that we're going to be putting in. Go right over the people that I've drawn in the background, go right over the fence, go right over the foreground areas, just making sure that this paper is all nice and wet. And the only place you really want to be careful is as you kind of bring that edge of your brush around the defined outline of your horse. And as I get down in around his legs, I'm going to be a little more careful because I do want to protect those negative shapes that will be his body. And yes, they will be dark later, but everything that we're going to do in the first 3 or 4 stages is all just a glaze that we're going to put in wet and wet around the center of interest. So it's important to protect the dry white paper of where the horse's body is and the cowboy's torso, hat, arm, etc. And one of the things I always tell people to do when you're at this stage, lean over so that you're looking obliquely at your paper so that the light is shining on it. You can see where there might be a flat matte area that says it's not dry yet. I'm going to use a real small brush here to get in a couple of areas in here between. I may have to come back and re-wet this as we start getting down around in his neck area, underneath his head, in between the horse's forelegs. Excuse me. So we've got a nice wet surface. I think I've managed to get everything addressed. And if everybody's at this stage, the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to mix up in our mixing well and our palette a really nice cool glaze. And when I say a cool glaze, I'm not worried about anything in this being perfect. This is like the sky color behind. And I'm going to start with I'll swing over here so you can see a nice cobalt. And then I might add just a little bit of raw umber to that. But it's primarily a cool glaze. And I may have to do a series of glazes to get this dark, but I'm just going to drop it in very quickly all around this behind the horse and rider. And you can just keep going back and getting more and more of this glaze and just kind of popping this in. You're tinting the paper. And I have I put a box in here to get this closer to the camera, but I needed to put a roll of tape or something under it to give it a little angle. And I'm just going to keep pulling this right on down. And then as I get closer to the ground level, I might add a little bit more raw umber to it. So it just picks up a little bit of warmth in that lower area. And maybe even a little bit of yellow ochre. But then go back to my glaze, my cooler cobalt glaze, and drop this in around his arm. And I'm not getting too close to the dry white shape. I can use the flat brush and come back and push it up against that the cowboy shape more carefully, but I just want to drop it into the wet area and let the water move the pigment around across the paper surface. There we go. And I think you can see how quickly that went. So while you're doing this, I'm going to just start dropping in some cool colors up underneath the horse's chest and belly, maintaining the negative shape for his legs. And we're letting the water move this glaze around on the paper surface so that we have a nice cool background. And what this does is it helps block out and make the horse and rider very visible, because we push some cool value just a couple of steps down in value up around the horse's torso, the cowboy's torso, and then we're defining it. We're blocking out the shapes. That's all we're doing. And when we dry this pigment will remain, and it will define the shape very nicely. And if any of you have ever noticed, anytime you have a negative shape, you can keep painting and painting, but you'll never lose that negative shape as long as you let the paint dry around it. And so this becomes a very permanent definition of our rider. Okay, I'm going to pull a little bit more warmth, a little bit of raw umber, kind of up from the base onto that fence. I've got a little, that's raw umber on the lower right. And then over on the lower left, I'm going to use a little bit of the yellow ochre to keep it a little bit warmer over here. And we'll just throw a little bit of water on there, pull some of that right up into the fence where the people are. There we go. All right, so keep working on that till you feel like you've got it all accomplished. I'm going to make sure and get this with my heat gun, get some of this pigment and water to evaporate so that it settles into the paper. One of the things that I want to talk a little bit about while we're doing this, while I'm drying this and while you're working on this, is the fact that all this glaze that we're doing are sedimentary colors. Sedimentary colors are earth tone colors. Cobalt's an earth mineral color. Umbers are an earth mineral color. Raw sienna, yellow ochre, those are all nice, coarse, granulating, sedimentary colors. The advantage in using the sedimentary colors for this glaze in the background is that these colors sit on the surface. They don't really penetrate down right away into the fiber of the cotton. So they're easy to manipulate. They're easy to pick up as we wet this again. If I wanted to take a tissue, for instance, and lighten something maybe along this fence, I could just go like this and just very subtly pick up a little bit of the value along that fence facade, because the pigment has not had a chance to soak down into the fiber of the cotton and stain it. The staining colors that we'll use later to get really rich, deep darks are going to be more chemically sounding, like quinacridone burnt orange, indrathine. Royal blue is a color from Holbein that I like a lot. It's very similar to Prussian blue. It's a staining color. It will take things down really dark immediately. It's like a phthalo or phthalamine blue. But at this stage in the painting, I don't want to stain anything. I want to just have these colors sit up in the tooth of the paper and be easy to manipulate. Now, the color that I put on here is really the color of the sky that we're going to see through this gap between the roof and the grandstand and over the top of the overhang. It also helps cool things off and pushes things back into the distance. So as we work with this and we have it damp, I still have a lot of really shiny surfaces on my paper, which tells me that the water that I put on this is still really wet. It's still sitting up on top of the surface of the painting. It hasn't had a chance to really evaporate yet. So it's important that you give yourself the opportunity to get this to dry. I always like to take a tissue and wick up any excess water and pigment that's around the edge of the paintings, because it can wick back into your painting and also keep the edges of your painting still very wet. So this helps the capillary action of pulling any excess water away from the painting and allows it to dry that much quicker. Now, what I want to do at this point, see how wet that is? It just left big fingerprints. I'm going to continue drying while you're finishing your glaze. Um, Anybody that didn't have their painting or their composition drawn out, this will give you time to get all that done. I hope everybody noticed that all of my lines for the rooftops, the back of the rooftop, the top of the grandstand, the front of the face of the fence, and the lower edge of the fence all converge to a vanishing point way off the page to the right. So it's just sort of a guesstimate of where that vanishing point is, but it allows everything that moves to the left to become bigger and bigger because it's getting closer and closer. And the lines for all of these elements converge and get narrower and smaller as they converge off to the right. So it's important that you establish some sense or some indicator of perspective as you're starting this painting off with the drawing. All right, this is still damp, but it's dry enough now that I can take one of my mop brushes. And if we go back to my little plan here, if we think about this, here's my plan. I'm going to start blocking in some darker darks up inside the rooftop that's protecting the grandstand. And I may drop in some more warmer tones within, as I glaze over the top of my blues, my cobalts in the grandstand. So what we'll end up doing is getting a mop brush. There's the mop brush, it's kind of a medium size. And I'm going to start introducing some of that quinacridone burnt orange with ultramarine blue. And I just want to get it nice and come over here so you can see. I'm just working over in a corner of my painting, getting some of that warm quinacridone burnt orange, which looks like a burnt sienna, but it's a more of a staining color. And I add some royal blue to that and some ultramarine to that. And it just starts taking it down into a really nice, lively, dark earth tone, kind of a brown, but it's got a little bit more liveliness to it. I can always add a little bit of orange here or there, but now you can faintly see where the lines are in my rooftop. I'm going to come in right around my guy's arm here on both sides of it and protect his hand, protect the top of his forearm, and just start working this brush around, just use the whole brush, fill in that space, and just follow this along the shape of the grandstand. And because the paper is still a little bit damp, these are fairly soft, feathery shapes, but I'm using paint that's drier than the wet of the paper. And so consequently, the paint will pretty much just stay right where I put it, even though it kind of feathers out a little bit. And I'll come back and I'll redefine the edge of the grandstand roof with drier paint once this is totally dry. But for now, it's working admirably to create that nice dark shape beneath the roof. And I can just pick up some of the cobalt, some of the various colors in my palette and just start adding dark as I come across. Using a mop gives me a lot of paint and a lot of water on my brush, so I can move across this shape without trying to be too careful and just really pull that right on across. While it's wet, I'm going to drop in some nice burnt orange to create some areas of warmth in there. We'll come back and add some really dark ultramarine and royal blues to give it some darker mottled areas around his, particularly right up against that white shirt. so that it really reads as a nice, strong value contrast in that looking underneath that roof. And I want to just keep bringing it right on across, fill it in fairly quickly. And then I can come back with maybe some alizarin crimson. I can come in with some ultramarine and just start putting in some darker colors up here towards the top at the leading edge of that overhang. And now I'm using the edge or the tip of my mop brush to kind of capture that corrugated rooftop. It's got some little ups and downs in it a little bit, but more importantly, I'm depositing some darker value right inside the leading edge of that rooftop. And then if you've got a few of these line drawings in there still, got to get underneath his armpit here to define that. We've got some structure that's coming down from this rooftop. I'm just going to put some really loose strokes in there. And then I'm going to clean my brush and get just mainly some more of that cobalt that I had for the first wash. And I'm just going to come in and just start establishing just a slightly darker value where the top of the grandstand is. As I come across, and there's people's heads in there, so we'll change this angle a little, or the edge work a little bit. But I just wanted to establish a slightly darker value where all the people will be. And as I come down, I'm going to bring down a little bit cooler cobalt right to the edge of where the grandstand stops before it transitions into that vertical fence. And I'm going to find that line. It comes right in and behind these Cowboys hats that are standing inside the arena. And I'm just bringing all this water down that's in my brush to give me a nice wet shape where all the people are. Once I get that damp surface filled in, I can then start coming in and dropping in different information that would suggest there's a whole crowd of people in there. I don't have to be too perfect. I don't have to be too defined at this point. I just need to block in the shape. We're just coming across this fence and we're establishing some strong little shape. Now, because this is all wet, I'm dropping in a little bits of raw umber in a couple of spots here. I can maybe go back and get some really strong darks with some royal blue and some burnt orange. And right up underneath some of these posts here, I'm going to put in some nice darks in here just to establish a little bit of dark. And then right up in this part, right behind the rider's torso, I'm just dropping in some really nice blue. It's got some ultramarine blue in it with some of that burnt orange in it, but it just darkens and pushes that dark right up closer to the rider. I'm rinsing my brush, adding a little bit of this transparent orange, dropping that in where all of a sudden these get a little warmer as it rolls downhill from gravity. Pulling that down and drop in some darker blues over in here. And then I'm going to switch up my brush, get a little smaller one here, get some water on it. And I'm just going to start dropping in some little speckles or splatter of water into these shapes to repel some of the paint, create these little dewdrops. And what they suggest is like little lighter areas where people's faces might be. I still need to come in and put some darks in a couple places. His mane is going to be very dark, so I'm going to leave the people kind of in the background in that grandstand a little lighter behind the horse's head. But as we get down a little lower, I might pick some of that up. I'll add a little bit more water in here. And then take a tissue, and I might just kind of blot some of this a little bit. And it just gives it a randomness and a lot of variety within the dark shapes. And as we dry this stuff and we get darker and darker, it just gets better and better. I'm gonna just give a few little suggestions of where some of these pillars would be that are holding up the grandstand. They kind of fade away as they come down into the darks. I want to get maybe a little bit more of the ultramarine, which granulates here. We'll add some of that cool colors in there. And then right along the bottom edge of the people, before they get to the fence, I'm going to come back in and establish a little bit of irregular edge on that fence, like it's got maybe some, slats that are not all perfectly alignment. And I'll pull some of that dark back up into the grandstand. So it just really establishes a nice dark across there. All right, time to dry. And then as this starts to dry, I'm going to splatter some water in it, but it's too wet now to do that. So I'm going to just start working with my hairdryer while you're finishing up your bit. I'm also seeing an opportunity to put a couple more darks that are structural, that are holding up part of the grandstand. We have a variety of little things that are part of the structure, and they don't have to be anything that's too complex. It's just sort of suggesting where these things are that hold everything together. The main thing is I want to get this dry. I'm going to use the edge of my brush here to pick up a little bit of this excess water, and then possibly take some dryer paint and pop some colors into all this grandstand of people to suggest that there's other stuff going on here. We'll get some bright violets going on, maybe a little bit of teal, light cobalt teal. Go back to my warm colors. Drop that in there. I might take a misting bottle then and just soften some of those marks a little bit. So it just kind of blends all around within that grandstand. This is still very wet. As I move my head around, I can see the high shine and sheen on the paper. The upper part is starting to dry, so I'm going to catch that with a little splatter just to give some variation and modeling back in some of these shapes. And then we'll let that dry. Might take my smaller flat, rinse it really well, get all the color off of it, and use that to just soften some of these little colored areas that have dropped in some warmth against some of the cool. Might come back in with a little bit more cool in a couple places. Push some water around on it just so I'm leaving some lighter areas and then some darker areas. And I'll just take a bottle and squirt it a little bit, and we can move that around. And then I would take one of my smaller mops and maybe just kind of pick up a little bit of some of this dark just by moving the water around. All right. I'll let you guys get caught up with that. I'm going to kind of wick up any excess water around the edges, work on letting this dry. I want it to be totally dry before I go on to the next step. All right. Now, one of the things that if we keep working in this area, we're just going to create a really muddy mess. So we've got to think about where can I go next in my painting to continue developing this grandstand. We've got to establish this rooftop that's facing upwards towards the sky. It's going to be a little bit darker than the sky behind it, but it's going to be cool. So we'll just take a big brush, like a big flat, and I'm going to mix up a glaze of just a very cool cobalt blue with some of the medium tone stuff that's in my palette. And I want to start and just capture the upper edge of that rooftop. Maybe wipe some of this off of my brush so it's not quite so wet, and just pull it down at an angle so that it's just allowing it to be slightly darker where it is up against the sky, creating sort of a silhouette effect. But then as it comes towards us, comes closer to us, it gets lighter and lighter. But what we're doing is we're establishing that there's some kind of a structure between us and that light sky. And we don't want it to be darker than the underside that's in shadow, but we just want it to have enough value to suggest that there's some structure there that is cooler than than what's up underneath there. It's got more sunshine on it, but it's darker in value than the sky behind and the sky that's peeking through this gap between the roof and the grandstand. So at this point, once that big shape is painted in, we just dry it again. And if we were out plein air painting or we were working in our studio, we would want to be taking our time and letting this dry naturally. But in the interest of moving this exercise along, I'm using a heat gun to get this paint to evaporate as quickly as possible and go back to a dry paper so I can keep working on these shapes. Does everybody understand? I've talked about it a lot in my classes. You can do a tremendous amount of painting as long as you keep drying each stage or each layer of shape. If I keep putting more and more and more paint into a damp area of my painting, it's going to get really muddy. It's going to get really, ugly, and it's going to leave brush tracks. It's going to pick up paint more than it puts down. But if you dry it, then you can glaze across it with another layer of warm colors or cool colors, and it'll just glow. And you'll have a lot of depth within your painting, and you won't see any problems. Now, in thinking about this, I want the leading edge beneath this overhang to be a little darker. And then as the eye goes back towards the rear of this underside of this roof structure, it's going to get a little more glowing, a little more bounce light, a little more reflective light. So we really want to emphasize the dark at the leading edge. Right now, it's just all pretty much the same value across there, but we're going to create the illusion of depth and the illusion of space up underneath there by really darkening some of this a little bit more. And I think what I'm going to use is a smaller flat and really work up some nice drier pigments. And you can see in my palette here, I'm trying to get a really nice dark blue, get just enough water to pull that all together, and then mix that with my quinacridone burnt orange. And it really makes a nice, rich, lively dark. So I don't have to use a Payne's gray or a neutral tint. I'm using more of these colors that give it body and depth. So now I'm going to come back to my grandstand using this drier application of paint, and I'm going to redefine that edge. You notice how the wet paper kind of bled up into the rooftop, but now I can come back and really redefine that edge quite a bit and push those darks. Now I can maybe add a little bit more of the glazing that I've already got mixed up in my palette from before. But I'm just going to really push that dark in a couple places along here to really emphasize the kind of the rough edge of that metal roof that has some corrugation to it. But then rather than paint the whole thing evenly, I'll just take some water and start blending that across what I had before. And then I might even add some orange in here, some really warm orange, my transparent orange across this stuff to really warm it up on the as we get down near the cowboy's arm. And the upper edge of that shape, I'm going to go back and get some really, really dark blues to make this feel really dark and cold and shadowy. Rinse my brush, come back with that orange and pop that in so that it really starts to feel like some bounce light back behind him. But you can see how fast this goes. We've already got 3/4 of the painting addressed here in our all these big washes. We haven't really had to waste a lot of time with detail. But see how this cool dark blue and then it hits that orange and it goes from cold to warm. I can even pick it up a little bit with my brush if I have to because it's still sitting on the surface of the paper. I'm going to tip it away so that that paint runs back towards that lip where it's going to be the darkest. There we go. And I'm going to leave this a little lighter back in here, almost like there's some maybe they're smoking back there. You know, the people and got all kinds of stuff happening up in there. We don't know what it is, but it makes it more interesting. If you kind of goof up and get a little bit in your sky, just take a tissue, pick it up, not a big deal. But always go back and wick around the edges to make sure you don't have a big mess that you're going to drag your hand through and sabotage your painting. I have a big puddle. I don't know if you can see it, and I want to finish it off around his hat so that it doesn't dry unevenly. But we really established a really nice, strong dark around his upper body and then come back with these warm colors. I'm going to actually drop in some darker darks up in that goes up into this rooftop and just drag some of these little extensions that just suggest there's structure back up in that shadow area that we just can't quite see everything that's going on. But it gives it just the illusion of a lot happening. Now, as we come down towards the fence, the people in the front rows, we can get a smaller mop and just pick up some more of that stuff that's in our mixing palette and just drop more of that along the edge of the fence. And I'm going to put in some Hooker's green, very transparent, and then maybe some alizarin crimson, and maybe some apple green, and then a little bit of the cobalt teal light. So these are all just little pops of color. And then I'll just take my spray bottle and soften them, let them all kind of run together. I'm not too worried about them, but it just suggests things that are happening up there in the stands. And now into that wet area, I'm going to take some of that same color that I mixed for my rooftop, and I'm going to drop a few of these darks randomly into some of this grandstand. Get some warms in there as well. And then we can always take our squirt and just soften those marks. I'm going to rinse my brush, get all the water off of it, wipe it off, and then just use the edge of my brush to kind of move some of this paint around, keep it kind of random, like it's a little bit of shadows here and there in the background. Get some darks right along this edge here a little as well. I want to continue to strengthen my front edge of the grandstand. but soften those edges so they don't feel linear. They're just give us some definition of the edge of the shape there. Always throw a little bit of water on, move that paint around, let it just react. Still pretty wet, so I'm going to just kind of come back in and take my rigger and just sort of suggest some directionality with some of the rooftop beams. And then we'll get this modeling going. Sometimes you can even take a kind of an old round that's just, and just go back in and kind of pick up a little bit of the color. And just all you're doing is you're just lightening some of that shape's value overall in just a couple of spots. And it just breaks it all up and just makes it feel like, oh, there's a little bit of haze in there that suggests there's something going on, a glaze, light, glare, whatever it might be. All right, so that takes us through pretty much our third wash. We can come back and embellish that a little bit later, but I want you to finish that up. I've still got a lake full of water just sitting on the surface of my paper here. So I'm going to take if you have something like that occur, take a brush, squeeze all the water out of it, and then use it to wick up any excess paint so that it has an opportunity to dry fairly evenly. Instead of, if it sits there as a big lake, it'll end up blooming and create, something that's very irregular that maybe wasn't in your intention. And I got a tissue in one hand here, and I'm just kind of wicking up any of that excess puddle so that it has a chance to dry evenly with the rest of the shape. It just is going to produce a better result if we can allow things to dry at an even rate. Now, let's take our ground next while we're waiting for all this to dry. And I'm just going to get a little bit more of the glaze that I happen to have in my mixing well. And I'm going to use the flat to come in at the base of the fence and just pull that straight down, just to kind of put a little coolness into the ground level there. And then I'll take a little bit of umber and drop that across some of these shapes and just dry brush it across. Maybe pick up a little bit of burnt sienna over here and just pull it down. And all I'm doing is I'm creating a lighter facade for that fence by just dropping in a glaze, which is a combination of cobalt blue, a little raw umber, and a little bit of burnt sienna. And I purposely left this area right beneath the horse's body a little lighter, pushed my darks over on the right, pushed a little warmer darks over on the left, and left it just a real subtle bit of light beneath the horse. We'll come back and dry and soften the edges after this dries by pulling some of that paint down across the fence, but we have to let it dry first. So I'll let you get caught up with that while I dry this some more. And then we can start playing with our horse and our people. I think our people against the fence, the observers, the exhibitors that are inside the arena watching the bucking event, they get painted next. They're going to be very cool. They're just kind of ghosted in. They're not our center of interest. We just want to suggest that there's some, stuff happening in the background there. And while I'm letting this dry, I'm getting some blooms and things, which is really nice. It just gives a little bit of texture in that foreground in the dirt of the ring or the arena. And I still have some damp area in my grandstand, so I'm going to use my rigger and just start dropping in some pure water, little droplets. And if I did this too soon, they wouldn't do anything. But now they'll start reacting with that wash that's on there, give me a mottled look that's kind of speckled that simulates people's heads. Excuse me. So we'll let that dry, and you can take it to this point, and then we'll kind of pause here before we go on to the next step. It's important that this get kind of dry. And as this, now this is all still pretty wet. Remember, that was a big lake of water. It's going to take quite a while for that to dry. But what we can do is as we start losing the shine on that shape, we can come back in and put those pillars and those support posts in, and they'll soften and they'll be very subtle, but it'll suggest that there's some structure coming down into the crowd that they're all sitting around that's holding up the rooftops. I'm just going to take my rigger and get some nice dark, and I'll just kind of drag that across here like so. And some of it come down into the stands. And it has sort of a scratchy dry brush effect. Some of it goes all the way up. Some of it comes down a little farther into the gray of the stands. And then maybe some of these other structural supports are just indicated a little bit. They're just very subtle. And it just gives a little hint of what's going on without being too just distracting. We don't want it to be something that we get pulled our eye away from anything. All right. How's this coming? This is pretty dry. I can actually take I don't want to use a rigger. I want to use a small flat, and I want to get some directionality on this rooftop here, just to suggest that there's some corrugation and some things happening. I'm going to add a little bit of the orange to this. Maybe it's a little bit rusted. A little bit of dry brush effect. But we don't want to do too much of that, just enough to kind of suggest that it's at an angle. And that works. Now, we talked a little bit about softening this fence over here. A big flat brush, clean, rinsed, and wiped. I'm going to take a tissue and I'm going to kind of squeeze the excess water out of it. So it's just damp. And that damp brush now, I can pick up some of this other paint that's already in the grandstand and just pull it down across those edges of the fence vertically. And with the dry brush effect, you get some skipping, and it just sort of is like old paint that's kind of scratchy. And it just softens that edge so that it doesn't attract our attention too much. Yeah, I think if anybody remembers, I've told them any long uninterrupted line or edge tends to draw our attention. So we want to make sure that we smudge and smear and don't necessarily draw attention to a strong edge line that's immaterial. It's not in our center of interest. It's not something there that's important. So all I'm trying to do is establish that there's a verticality to this fence, and it's old and it's weathered. So we'll let that dry, because it is, even though it was a dry brush effect, it's still a little wet. And I want to come back in next and paint our observers, our exhibitors that are up against the fence watching the main event. And those will be very, very subtle. But we got to have dry paper to paint again. So I'll just use a kind of a medium size, actually a fairly small size mop. I got this really nice little mop here that's kind of a small size. And I'm just going to pick up some cobalt glaze. I want it to be not as dirty as some of the other stuff I used in the grandstand, but I want to have just enough value so that we can start to see the shape of these cowboys that are kind of standing up along the edge of the fence. And rather than make it all one shape, I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber to this just to warm him up. Here's a guy there he's got a little hat on. And then maybe pick up some more of the blue. And we can get a little darker in a couple of spots here. It looks pretty dark, but I have a feeling that it's going to dry. That's mostly water, so it's going to dry fairly light. I'm going to add a little bit of warmth to where his face would be, and where the top of his hat would be, I'm going to get it a little cooler. And then there's another guy that's barely visible, and so I don't want him to be as dark. And I'm just going to drop in just a shape of a person standing back there. He's obliterated because of the horses in the way, but it's just part of the background color of what's going on. And then we've got a guy squatting down. He's got some dark jeans on, so I'm going to use some umber and ultramarine and get his two knees that are up, and then get a little bit of this neutral color for his hat. And as it goes back behind him, it's going to get warmer where his face is. And then he's got maybe a lighter colored shirt on, so we'll just kind of give him a softer glaze for his arms and so forth. And the tops of his arms are pretty much just white. He'll have some pink where his hands are, not pink, but some warm color, whatever I can find here in my palette that's going to suggest maybe his hands are there and a little bit of his face. And then down around his boots, they'll be a little cooler, a little darker. And I'll just take my brush and just kind of wipe out the bottoms of these boots where they're just standing on the ground. It just it grounds them a little bit. They don't need to have a whole lot of definition there, just something that says there's a little bit of disturbed dirt down around where their feet are, and it just kind of is all anchoring them. Next guy in line, let's see what he looks like. These guys are all going to be kind of cool blue color. So we can just kind of help us see what's going on. His face may be a little warmer. I'll use this little raw sienna that I got here. We'll just put a little bit of warmth there, a little darker where his other side of his hat is. And just take water and let that run down behind, get his shoulder a little darker. He's behind this other guy. So I'm just kind of pushing some dark glaze back in there. Get a little bit of take a little bit of water, just soften some down towards the base. I might even come back in right at the base of the fence and put a little bit of raw sienna, or I'm sorry, burnt sienna, and some of this blue in a couple of places just to kind of break it up, soften it. And then This guy, I'm going to keep fairly light. I might even put the fence a little bit behind him. And then the other side of him, he might be a little darker. Just use the water, rinse my brush, and grab that glaze that I just put on there and just soften it. Take some color, some burnt sienna, and then maybe make his hat a little darker. And then his jeans there, maybe. I think we just have one more guy here. We'll just let him. Trying to keep the ground as loose as possible. And then our little fellow here that's and I think you can kind of see it's not real critical that these are perfect. They're just indications of people back here watching the show. And I'm just going to take this guy and just almost obliterate part of his backside. He's up against that fence. There's part of its shadow. He just kind of blends into the fence a little bit. The other guys may have to have a little bit more skin tone. But I don't want to leave any really obvious marks. I just want to get their face to kind of blend in with everything else that's going on. So keep it soft, keep it light, keep it not too obvious, and let it dry. So have fun with these figures, but don't make them too defined. Just keep them kind of a glaze. Think glaze instead of painting hard marks. And if you just lightly sketched in them, it should make it fairly easy. You're not trying to, bring them too much attention to these guys. So it's, you have to go back and darken a little bit. That's okay. But don't get too carried away. It just populates and puts some people in the middle ground there to help us see what's going on. Now I'm going to test and check my grandstand. The paper's still kind of damp, but I can probably come back and splatter some white paint on that later. In the meantime, I want to get some of my darks in there for those posts. They dried a little too light. So I'm going to try to get some drier, darker paint. And I'll come in here with a few little indications here that says, oh yeah, there's lots of structure in there that comes down into this. There, not too bad. And I'm just going to throw in some darks back and maybe make them a little cooler back in here. some back in here that kind of comes down the side of the I don't want that to be, I want it to be pretty random, so I'm just gonna hit it with a little bit of a squirt bottle to soften the edges. And then take some really dry, warm color and drop it in next to them in a couple spots. And then we've got some people's heads that are sticking up. And they will be in varying degrees of dark. Some will be mid-tone, some will be pretty dark. But all I'm doing is just kind of breaking up that back line of where all the people are. And I can always take a little bit of squirt and just soften it. And then once that starts to dry, we can drop in a little bit of water in there. See if it'll repel some of that. Create a little bit of blooming. There we go. So those are all the people. They're back in there and they're all just kind of, you just very lightly kind of stipple in a few spots, not everywhere, not all the same. Use different colors, maybe a little bit of red here and there to kind of introduce some warmth. And then you can always kind of hit it with a little bit of water just to soften it. Elevate this pretty steep. And then I want to get it to roll. Get some of the water to kind of come downhill. So I get this movement coming across the stands. Maybe even running across my fence a little bit. It's almost like a shadow there. So I'm going to pause while I dry again. And I really want to get this nice and dry before I start working on my horse. Because everything that we painted so far is either a glaze or a very soft, kind of wet and wet background color. Not all that critical. We're going to dry brush the horse, and that's where the brilliant color, the shiny coat on the horse's, the sheen on his coat is going to really pop. And that means the paper has to be totally dry. And I'm going to leave his shirt and his hat as white as possible until we get farther along. We'll get the darks in on the horse's body next. That's going to be our next step in the process. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to use for his rump and his belly. I'm going to get some really nice dark burnt orange, like a quinacridone burnt orange. We use a little bit of blue with that to take it to a really dark place. But I'm also going to introduce some greens, some reds, like alizarin, because if you look at a horse's body, the light will catch the hide at different angles, and you'll get different sheens. So we don't want to have just a flat shape. We want to have some highlights of warmth. We want to have some really cool areas, and I'm going to use about a 3/4 inch flat to get this to work right. And so I'm going to start off with quinacridone, burnt orange, a real bright, dry mix of this, a little bit of royal blue, and I want to make sure I protect the whites where some of the rigging is on the horse's flanks. So I'm just going to come down around his rump, and you can see how that dark just pops against those mid-tones that are back in the grandstand. It was all water and wet, so it never dries really dark. It has sort of a softness to it. And that allows us to come back in now with this really nice dark that we're establishing on the horse's legs. And he comes around his elbows and his fetlocks. And I'm leaving some areas that are a little bit warmer, some areas that are a little bit cooler. It's still a damp shape, but we want to get down on his belly there a little bit more red. So I'm going to put some alizarin crimson in there. And then I'm going to transition to a hooker's green, which is a really transparent green. And that green will just kind of give us a nice little change in the sheen that's coming through on his body, down on his belly. And then I'll go back to my burnt orange, a real dry application of that. And then pick up a little bit of the royal blue and drop it into the wet shape. And let these colors just kind of move around on their own within that shape. Get a nice variation within the darks. Now that back leg, the far back leg is all part of this dark. So it has to be really dark. That means a little bit drier, a little bit more of the blue with the orange to get a really rich dark. And it's almost like in silhouette. So I'm not adding a lot of water there. I've just got enough water to get it to flow off my brush, but it's coming down. And as it comes down that foreleg, I'm adding a little bit more water so that it tends to have a little bit of sheen to it, like the light is shining on it, but then the underside of the fetlock is going to be very dark against that light fence. So we can see behind this hoof in the foreleg. And then we get a lighter, more of a, I don't know, raw umber. I'm going to go maybe just to the glaze for the that we used in the grandstand on his hoof. So it's a lighter area. I want to get it really nice and dark right across here and the underside of his leg. All right. Now underneath his saddle, I'm going to come back in and get a little bit darker. It's still pretty wet, so I can come back in and drop that in. And then this leg here, that it comes forward, it's going to be really very close to us. So it's going to have more light on it. So we want to keep the top part of that foreleg and upper arm fairly light. So I'm just going to rinse my brush and take that color that I just put on there and drag a damp brush across it so that it feels like there's light hitting the upper part of the leg and the knee. And then as it turns and goes down the foreleg and behind the knee, it gets really dark. And underneath there, I'm going to take that dark right on up. And then underneath his front part of his hoof there, we're going to get a little darker. I'm going to come back in with my really warm, burnt orange. And then rinse my brush and just get this all kind of together. Just kind of just connect the two colors. Let the blue run into the warm, and then just give a little bit of warmth, not much, just a glaze there on his hoof. It needs to be cooler, so I'm going to just take some of the glaze from the my palette, my mixing palette, and just drop it into that wet shape. And you can see what's happening. Now I'm going to finish the upper part of his body, and we'll get more of the darks coming in behind the stirrup and the cinch. There's the cowboy's heel of his boot. And then up in here, I'm going to push this right up underneath his chaps and his leg, the rider's leg, which is flying upward because of the centrifugal force of there we go. And now we've got to go down behind the chest between the two front legs is going to be cool and dark because it's in shadow. So I'm just using my mop to kind of follow the contour of the cowboy's boot and stirrup and define those as negative shapes. Bring that dark up into his neck. And then I want to get the bottom part of his neck pretty dark where it comes towards his head. But then as it comes up his neck and you get more and more light, you're going to have less and less dark value. It's going to become cooler and lighter. So I'm going to use more of that glaze from the grandstand right across the neck muscles. And I'm going to leave the white of the bridle. He's got a couple of straps here. So I'm very carefully leaving some whites visible. And I'll come back in and darken his head and around his eyes. But I'm trying to just define the negative shape for the bridle. We'll let that dry for a minute. Excuse me. So you can see the lower and back portion of the horse has taken on a pretty dark, rich color. We'll come back in and enhance the rider's chaps, his jeans, his boots, his cinches and rigging. But right now, we just want to have a nice dark against that really back, that half lit mid-tone background. Now the muscles in the horse's neck are twisting, and so we're going to get a little darker right as he comes down like that. And then above that neck muscle, it'll be a little darker and cooler, right below the hairline of his mane. Clean your, rinse your brush and soften that mark so it just kind of rolls across that bulging neck muscle. And I've got to get a little bit more warmth right behind his bridle there. And right in between he's got a halter and a bridle on. I'm just dragging that back towards the rider. And then I'm going to take this same dark color and it's going to go right in between, down along his cheekbone and his jawline to really define where that bridle is. I can just take a little water, fill that in, come down along his chin and really create a nice dark shape. And then just water on my brush as I come forward. I'm going to allow the shape of his nose and his nostril just to be all filled in with a wash. And then he's got, I'm just basically filling in with a tone so I can come back in and add darks later for the eyes and everything. I'm not ready to do that. I just want to get it blocked in so that his bridle stands out as a negative shape. I can also take a little bit of alizarin with some raw sienna. Maybe get a little of that in his mouth there. Just it's wet, so it just kind of runs. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to take the same colors that I'm using, but really dry, and it's the burnt orange and a little bit of the royal blue, and I'm going to come in behind where the mane is and just create some dry brush, quick little strokes that come out away from his head that suggest where his mane is, using the tip of that brush and the side of that brush to create these nice little shanks of hair that are coming away. And then I can also take the same color and define his ear, but I'm going to change it up and get warmer on the front side. And then the little socket kind of behind and around his eyes is a little darker. Clean my brush and just pull this dark around towards the front of his face. I'm going to take this really dark, cold blue, and I'm going to define the shape of his nose around that nostril. A little bit under his chin. And I haven't done his eye yet. I'm going to actually soften this whole thing so I can come back in and add some darks around his eye once that dries. Soften this transition from his neck muscles up into his head. And I'm probably going to have to come back in and glaze his neck a little bit. That's too much of a highlight across his neck. But we'll let that dry and see how that looks. We still have the one far front leg coming down. That has to be a little darker and cooler than the foreleg in front. So I'm going to work with a kind of a cool glaze color, keeping that dark, but then also add a little bit of water to it so that it gets lighter as it comes down, right into his hoof. And then right up the very top, I'm going to drop in some nice warm darks. Get that nice and dark. But keeping that leg just a little bit lighter than the one in front. And as this thing dries, we'll come back in and punch up some of the little details. His back leg, he's got a white sock on there, but it needs to be cooled off a little bit. So I'm going to just add a little bit of cool glaze to that. And then get really darker as we drop down into the rear hoof. And underneath his fetlock. Same with this hoof, it needs to be bigger. This guy's moving. Already feels like he's got a lot of movement in him. While we're waiting for our horse to dry, we can start, as long as we don't put our hand in the middle of the wet paint, we can come back now and start playing with our cowboy. I want to get a little bit of shade on his hat, and I penciled it in when I drew it so that we would see that and could darken it and get a little bit of the shadowing that we need to establish where the hat is. But rather than leave it all blue, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre as kind of bounce light within that hat and up inside there. And then on the underside, get a little cool from the bottom edge of that hat, and that goes right down into his face, which has got some orange shading in it, because that's the warmth of his head. And we don't really see a whole lot of detail there because the hat obliterates the face, but we definitely want to have the feeling that it's kind of in shade. And same for his hand. We can come down and put some warmth on his hand, then go transition to like a yellow ochre or raw sienna and warm it up as it comes up out of the shade of his palm. His fingers are gripped. So now we've given some warmth to his hand and his face. I'm going to slip down to his belt and give us a little bit of warmth here with some raw sienna, burnt sienna. Slip into a little bit of umber and come across the bottom, and then up inside where his shafts are flapping upward violently. I want to pick up some really dark burnt orange, the quinacridone burnt orange. Push my damp clean brush towards that so that it gradually gets lighter as it comes towards the viewer. We'll put a little darker blue over on the one side here, and then we'll put a little bit of the yellow ochre as it comes down this way. But right up at the very tip, up inside that shaft, the underside of it, we want this to be fairly dark, that it shows like it's flapping towards us and we're seeing up inside the shafts. And maybe the shafts themselves have some fringe on them. He might have blue jeans on. So blue jeans, like a Levi blue jean color, is going to be a little bit of raw umber and a little bit of ultramarine. We'll get that coming down. And then I want to get it lighter where the sunlight is on this knee. So we'll have just a hint of blue transitioning into that dark. And I want to leave the stirrup like a metal silver stirrup. So I want to make sure that we keep that really the lightest light. I'm going to get his boot a little bit darker up underneath his jeans. And then we'll get his heel and his sole in a moment. But got to get this just right. Now, back in here behind his knee, behind the saddle, it's all got some really strong darks in there. This is all going to be darker underneath his saddle seat. We don't need to give all the details. We just need to put some darks there in a couple of places to sort of define that. I want to get his belt that's holding the shafts a little darker and then blend it back up into the strap that's buckled to his rest of it. It's got some wrinkles coming down. And then the stirrups, I'm going to use a little gamboge here just to brighten it up. We'll have a little bit of orange and gamboge together. See if I can't get the right color on here. There we go. We'll put a little of that on there and then just suggest that maybe there's just some color on there. That's too bright, but we want to let that dry and then we'll come back in with some shadows on top of it. As soon as his boot's dry, the upper part of his boot, we can come in and do his sole. But while we're waiting for that, let's think about his shirt. I'm going to clean my palette and take a little brush or some squirts and just wipe out an area to mix up some really nice, clean, light glaze of blue, cobalt blue. Why am I cleaning my palette so carefully? I don't want to have a real muddy, warm blue. I want this to be a white shirt, but some of it's in shadow, so I have to just get a nice, clean, very transparent cobalt blue that's just pretty well watered down. And we can always punch it up in places, but we want the lightest part of that shadow to show up. So as he's bending over towards us, that means that this part of his shoulder is going to be a little cooler. He's going to have folds of blue coming across his and tucking in behind the shafts there. And then underneath his arm over here is going to be a little cool. So I can come in and just put a few little streaks of where it's in shadow. And I think that's maybe pretty close. We'll get underneath his collar here a little bit. And then the arm that's coming down, that's holding the bridle. We'll get a little shadow on that. It still reads as a white shirt, but it has a little bit of tint to it. And as that dries, I'm going to add just a little bit darker shadows in there, in those wet areas, so that we really can see. Yeah, that looks pretty good. All right, is this dry? We're gonna come back in underneath the buckle. We're gonna add a little bit of blue right across some of these cinches, just to knock down some of the brightness. And then I'm gonna add a little bit of dark to this leg, a little bit to this leg, to this hoof. That little dot of white there, that's his other boot. So we want to keep that fairly light, but I also want to make sure that we understand that that's a boot that's coming forward. So I'm going to make it warmer than it would otherwise be. And then the underside of his sole on the boots that are closest to us, I'm just going to kind of cool it off with a little bit of a glaze, push that right up underneath the stirrup and underneath the heel. And then as that dries, I'll come back over the underside of the stirrup with a little bit of, you know what? I will end up glazing a little bit of the silver stirrup on the underside. So there's that. Now we need to go back into the horse's head. How are we doing? Everybody catching up? That's part of his chaps that are flapping up. I'm looking at this and they're just a little bit too light. So we're going to create the illusion that they're flapping and the underside of them is a little darker. I think that helped just by making that darker. Now, horse's ear is not showing up, so I got to make his ear a little bigger, a little warmer, and then come down behind his eye. There's a kind of a recessed area just above the horse's eye. It's always a little darker. Part of his jawline going down to his muzzle gets darker. And then I want to let's just take some of this color and just pull it down. I want part of his face to be a little lighter. So we'll get part of his eye defined. And then underneath it, I want it to be a little warmer. And what we're doing is we're really defining where the bridle is by darkening the shapes around it. And we get a little cooler right down in here. Let's get his, make this darker against that background so it reads. I'm going to darken these hooves a little bit in a couple spots. And I'm going to add just a little bit more of the shade on his shirt. Put a little hat band on, maybe. And just pull some of that shade across the front of his hat from his crown. It's all lost in shadow. And I want to get maybe a little bit of dark inside his shirt sleeve there, shadow. All right, we're going to stop here, dry. Let's take a little bit of, I'm just going to use this flat brush, but I'm going to get all the color off of it. And then just put a little bit of gamboge, maybe a little bit of yellow, and just come across part of his bridle in a couple spots, particularly the underside of the bridle, just so that it has some warmth to it. And then part of his cinch, do the same thing. Get rid of that, and then get a smaller brush and just get a silver, kind of a very light blue cobalt glaze. And I just want to get the bottom part of this stirrup done, just so it feels like it's cool on the underside of his boot. And then I did painted through his mouth. So I'm going to use a stiffer brush, and I'm just going to pick up a little bit of this paint, see if I can make that lighter. It's not cooperating, so we won't worry about it. But you can kind of see inside his mouth now. And once that dries, I'm going to put a little bit of, I'll redefine that opening a little bit. But while we're waiting for that to dry, you remember I said we'll take a damp brush, a clean, damp, flat brush like this. I'm going to really clean it, get all the color off of it, take a tissue, and just get most of the sloppy water off of it. It's still got a lot of color on it, so I want to make sure it's rinsed and cleaned really well. It's just damp. It's not wet. And I'm going to take it across his legs, and I'm just going to gently pull down so that it blurs the bottoms of his legs a little bit against those people that are standing there. And it kind of simulates movement or motion, and it pushes the people behind back a little bit. They're not as obvious. And it just says, okay, this has got some stuff going on. And I want to get a little bit of a wet mop brush with a nice little bit of yellow ochre, raw umber, just a glaze. And I'm just going to kind of splatter some of that on, rinse my brush, and just kind of create a little bit of rough terrain, some darks in here. And then just take a little squirt bottle underneath them and just soften them. I like that dry brush. We'll just leave that in there. But that just kind of roughs up the arenas, the dirt in the arena, to suggest that he's been jumping and there's a lot of turned up soil in there. The last thing that we will do once this dries is we'll come back in with a little bit of white gouache, and I'm going to put a little bit of splatter up in the stands. I'm going to put a little bit of just highlights, suggested highlights, very subliminal, not too obvious, that kind of tell us what's going on. Let that dry really well. And then I'll take my rigger, and we'll start off with just a little bit of umber with some of this blue glaze. And it's pretty wet on the end of my brush. I'm just going to lightly hold it in between my forefinger and my thumb, and just hold it over the foreground and just tap a little bit of it up across the fence, like he's really disturbed a lot of the dirt and his clods are flying around because of that violent motion that he's got. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to find some, I have a little tube of white gouache. This is titanium white. And I keep a little handy mixing palette nearby. I don't ever want to put this white gouache in my regular palette. But I'll squeeze a little bit off into this and set the tube aside, get my rigger, get it clean, and I'll just kind of mix up a little bit of wet white gouache, make sure it's kind of runny. Not too big of drops, but just kind of wet. And I'm going to very lightly drop a little bit of this into the stands in a few places. And it gives a few little subliminal highlights of stuff in the stands that might be reflections on people. You know, I can always come back in and soften some of it. I can even take a little misting bottle and squirt some of it, or take a tissue. There's lots of things you can do just to soften them a little bit, and it just gives a few little highlights here and there of stuff in the sands. Now, I'm looking at his shaps here that are flapping up. I want to get this a little darker. It keeps dry and light. It's because I use so much water. So I'm going to get up underneath there and suggest that that's a little darker against his leg. It's coming forward. His leg is kicking really forward pretty dramatically to stay in the stirrup. And I'm going to darken underneath, you know, his pant leg where it goes up into the shadows. And I'll just soften that a little bit. So it feels like, oh, there's his boot. It's going up underneath the pant leg. I need to make the lower edge of his calf a little darker, a little cooler. And so I'm just going to come back in and make that a little darker as it goes up underneath where his shaps are. And all of a sudden, it reads pretty well. The neck of the horse needs to be a little bit less, you know, we'll get a little darker in here. We still see the muscle on his neck, but just by adding that little bit of dark glaze across there helps push his neck down. And I talked about touching up that his mouth shape. I want to bring this up. I'm going to get a bit of orange and burnt orange and bring that up. Get a little bit of the blue. Not bad. If we need to come back in and darken his rump a little bit, you can always do that up against that stand so that we see the upper part of his rump has a really strong positive shape against the midtones of the back. Uh, what do you call it? Stand. So I'm going to put some line work in there where his saddle is. He's a saddle bronc. They've got a saddle on him. It's got a cinch, and we're still seeing part of that little shadow across his foreleg here. But it reads pretty well, and it's a lot of movement and activity and energy without being too overt. This fellow that's to the right of the horse, I'm going to give him just a little bit more definition on his side because his shadow side is reading pretty well, but his body gets lost. These guys are pretty just vague. We don't want to draw too much attention to them, but I do want them to be able to be readable as people that are out there kind of watching the show. There. Now, to finish a painting, we want to try to your signature always needs to balance. All the activity and energy center of interest is over here on the left, upper left. So the lower right, I purposely left pretty blank. There's not a lot there. I'm going to use a really nice dark burnt orange that we've been using in the rest of the painting. Same colors, so it fits right in. It's just more texture, but I want to get it signed right across this fence here. It just kind of becomes part of the texture of the painting. We don't have to do anything further, but it just finishes it off. And the center of interest is the negative shape of his white shirt and hat, which shows how he's riding this, this really energetic bucking bronco. And the Bronco is a dark positive against that midtone and against the lighter value of the fence. So we've got some positives and negative shapes that are very strong contrast in our center of interest. The background is pretty soft, and yet we can make out the shape of the grandstands, the overhead roof, the fence. There's a bunch of cowboys that are exhibitors that are in the ring up against, up against the fence. So it gives the context of what's going on, but all of our attention goes to the rider and the horse.